Today is May 18th, 2026, and to understand everything that is happening right now, everything that drove Iran to strike a nuclear power plant during a ceasefire on May 17th, everything that has the Energy Secretary publicly stating that the military method will be employed in the coming days, everything that has Delta Force operators sitting in the Middle East since March waiting for the Isfahan authorization, everything that has Operation Sledgehammer named, prepared and positioned within striking distance of its targets, you need to understand one night, May 7th. Because May 7th is the night that the entire strategic logic of this conflict was decided, even if the world has not fully processed what was decided on that night and why its implications are still being felt in every development that is unfolding around us right now. There was an old principle in military strategy. You cannot destroy what you cannot see. On the night of May 7th, somewhere in the dark waters of the Strait of Hormuz, the United States found a way around that problem. It did not go looking for Iran's hidden weapons. It did not need to. It waited, patiently, deliberately, for Iran to bring those weapons out of hiding on its own. What followed was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was the closing act of a trap that had been set weeks, possibly months in advance, and it produced the most complete single-night destruction of a military doctrine in the history of the modern Persian Gulf, followed by the most revealing propaganda failure in the Islamic Republic's 47-year history. And now, 10 days later, with an Iranian drone sitting inside the perimeter of a nuclear power plant, and the American military surging its wild weasel sorties over the strait at continuous combat air patrol tempo, the question is not whether what happened on May 7th was decisive. The question is whether the organization that failed so completely on May 7th understands yet how decisively it failed, and whether the answer to that question is visible in the Baraka strike that tells you, in the most direct possible operational language, that it does not. But let us back all the way up. Because to understand why May 7th was not just a military engagement, but the operational hinge point of this entire conflict, why everything before it was prologue and everything after it is consequence, you need to understand what Iran spent decades building beneath the Persian Gulf coastline, why it was building it, what it was designed to accomplish, and what the night of May 7th produced when the decades of construction met the Aegis combat system of 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers positioned in the strait specifically to provoke the IRGC into doing exactly what it did. Here is the complete picture of what Iran built beneath the mountains and the coastline of its southern provinces over the course of decades of patient military construction. Iranian military planners spent years carving tunnel networks into the sedimentary rock and salt formations along the southern coast of Iran, specifically in the geography that borders the Persian Gulf, where the Strait of Hormuz's 21 nautical mile navigational choke point creates the leverage point that has been central to Iranian strategic thinking since the IRGC was first organized as a revolutionary force. On Keshem Island, the largest island in the Persian Gulf, these tunnel networks reportedly stretch for dozens of kilometers beneath the surface, carved at depths and in configurations designed specifically to defeat the satellite imagery analysis that American and Israeli intelligence services have been applying to Iranian military infrastructure continuously for decades. In Bandar Abbas, the primary base of the IRGC naval forces and the commercial port through which a substantial portion of Iran's import trade flows, the IRGC constructed underground naval bases at depths that make satellite detection extremely difficult during peacetime, when the facility's access points are sealed and the thermal and acoustic signatures of their contents are not detectable from orbit. The IRGC called these facilities missile cities. The name was not an exaggeration, and it was not chosen for rhetorical effect. Inside these fortifications sat stockpiles of Noor and Qadr anti-ship cruise missiles, Chinese derivative systems with ranges and warhead capabilities that made them genuine threats to naval vessels transiting the confined waters of the strait. Zulfikar ballistic missiles with ranges exceeding 1,000 kilometers. Older silkworm systems for close-range tanker strikes in the confined waters near the strait's northern approaches. And alongside the missiles, hundreds of fast attack boats that the IRGC internally designated Red Wasps sheltered in mountain-carved coastal facilities and designed for swarm tactics, the operational doctrine of overwhelming a larger and more capable ship through sheer numbers, speed, coordinated approach vectors, and saturation of its defensive systems with more simultaneous contacts than any single point defense system can service before one or more of them closes to weapons release range. This was Iran's sea denial architecture. Its purpose was to create a credible threat to any naval force operating near the strait, sufficient to either deter American naval power from enforcing any blockade or sanction regime, or to impose sufficiently catastrophic costs on American naval assets if deterrence failed, that the political will to maintain the enforcement would collapse under the weight of the casualties. The problem for the United States was fundamental, and had been fundamental for as long as the IRGC's underground network existed. As long as Iran's forces stayed underground, they were operationally untouchable. You cannot legally strike underground facilities in sovereign Iranian territory without the kind of evidence of active military activity emanating from those facilities that the underground design was specifically built to prevent from reaching satellite sensors. You cannot confirm the precise layout and contents of concealed facilities through overhead imagery alone when the facility's design has specifically incorporated the countermeasures that defeat overhead imagery collection. And you cannot strike them without triggering a broader escalation whose international legal and diplomatic costs exceed the specific military benefit of the preemptive strike. So the United States designed a situation in which Iran would open the tunnel doors voluntarily. The strategic logic of the trap was, in hindsight, remarkably clean in its design and remarkably patient in its execution. Place visible, provocative assets in the strait. 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, the USS Mason, the USS Truxtun, and the USS Rafael Peralta, transiting through the Strait of Hormuz as part of the Prosperity Freedom naval escort mission that had been running since the blockade's initiation. On paper, these were routine transits. In practice, these ships were positioned where they were specifically because they were designed to be seen, to provoke, and to absorb the first move, while the force architecture that had been pre-positioned around them waited for the moment the IRGC could not resist. Make that positioning temporally coincident with sufficient economic pressure from the ongoing blockade that IRGC commanders were operating in an environment of institutional panic. Enough weeks of hemorrhaging tanker export revenues, enough political pressure from a civilian government that the IRGC had effectively sidelined, but whose economic deterioration the IRGC was nonetheless responsible for managing the consequences of. Enough internal institutional pressure from IRGC factions competing for relevance in a wartime command structure, until the temptation to strike becomes irresistible. Because striking looks like the only action available that demonstrates the IRGC is still a credible military force, rather than an organization that is simply absorbing punishment. Then wait. The IRGC's leadership was under genuine institutional strain in the weeks before May 7th. The blockade had steadily eroded Iran's tanker export revenues with each passing week, bringing fewer barrels exported, more downward pressure on the rial, more internal questioning of whether the regime's strategy was producing the American political capitulation it was supposed to eventually force. IRGC naval commanders were operating in what multiple accounts describe as an environment of institutional panic. The organization's domestic narrative of the brave IRGC holding the line against American aggression was increasingly difficult to sustain in an information environment where the economic consequences of the blockade were visible to every Iranian citizen who paid for food, medicine, and electricity. When 3 American destroyers materialized in the strait in the precise configuration that the IRGC's attack doctrine had been rehearsing as the trigger scenario, senior IRGC commanders apparently concluded the strategic moment had arrived. A diplomatic dispute between the United States and Gulf states had briefly restricted American base access in ways that IRGC intelligence interpreted as a temporary window in the American force posture's coverage. The opportunity, they calculated, would not present itself again. They were catastrophically wrong. The pre-positioning evidence is the most revealing single indicator of how thoroughly the United States had anticipated this decision. Prior to the IRGC attack, at least 5 KC-135 aerial refueling aircraft had launched from the UAE. 4 more tanker aircraft were airborne over Israel and Jordan. This kind of pre-positioned aerial refueling support is not improvised in response to an unexpected attack. Refueling aircraft require launch, transit, and track establishment times that precede the events they are positioned to support. Their pre-positioning before the IRGC had fired its first weapon means that United States Central Command had received credible intelligence of the IRGC's attack intentions and had activated a pre-planned counterstrike sequence before a single Iranian weapon was launched. The trap was not just set, it was already being triggered when the IRGC's commanders gave the order to open the tunnel doors. The broader American military architecture surrounding the strait on the night of May 7th makes the operational picture complete. 3 carrier strike groups, the USS Abraham Lincoln, the USS Gerald R. Ford, and a 3rd carrier group that had arrived in early May, constituted the largest concentration of American naval power in the Persian Gulf region in decades. Their combined flight decks carried F-35C stealth fighters, FA-18EF Super Hornets, and EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft. On land, F-22 Raptors were positioned in Israel, F-15Es in Jordan, F-16s in Saudi Arabia. MQ-4C Triton long-endurance surveillance drones were flying continuous orbits from the UAE, building the persistent overhead intelligence picture that allowed every element of the American force structure to track every movement in the strait in real time. The United States could see everything that was in the water, everything that was in the air, and everything that was emerging from the tunnel doors as the IRGC activated its attack sequence. Iran could see almost nothing of what the United States was seeing. The information environment was as asymmetric as the military capability environment, and it was that informational asymmetry, more than the weapon systems asymmetry, that determined the outcome of May 7th before the first weapon was fired. Kamikaze drone swarms as the first saturation layer, designed to consume American defensive interceptor capacity by forcing the defending ships to engage large numbers of relatively inexpensive one-way attack systems that approach from multiple vectors simultaneously. A mix of ballistic and cruise missiles as the penetration layer, intended to exploit any gaps in the air defense coverage that the drone swarm had saturated. And armed fast attack boats, including the Hadar 110 and 120 missile launching vessels that the IRGC had unveiled publicly just months earlier in February 2025, and that represented the newest expression of the organization's swarm and maritime strike doctrine, operating together in a layered assault that the IRGC's operational planners had designed to overwhelm any single defensive system through simultaneous multi-domain pressure. This was not improvised aggression. It was the IRGC's practiced asymmetric warfare doctrine executed at the operational scale for which it was designed. The kind of coordinated, multi-axis, multi-domain saturation attack that Iranian planners had rehearsed for years as their specific answer to American naval supremacy in the confined waters of the Strait, where geography limits the maneuver space that technologically superior forces normally rely on. And then the Aegis combat system answered it. The Aegis ballistic missile defense system is the platform that makes the 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers the specific trap mechanism that the United States needed for this operation. Aegis is capable of simultaneously tracking hundreds of airborne targets, assessing each for threat level and classification, and launching interceptors within seconds of threat identification without requiring human authorization for individual engagement decisions. It is, in the precise language of military systems engineering, a closed-loop engagement system. It processes the threat environment and executes its engagement sequence faster than any human decision cycle can intervene. On the night of May 7th, the Aegis systems aboard the USS Mason, USS Truxtun, and USS Rafael Peralta processed the IRGC's entire coordinated attack wave and destroyed it with a completeness that left United States Central Command in a position to subsequently confirm that none of the 3 destroyers sustained any damage and there were no American casualties. The drone swarms were intercepted before reaching effective weapons release range. The cruise missiles were shot down. The fast attack boats that entered the water were sunk. The Hadar 110 vessels that represented the newest expression of the IRGC's maritime strike doctrine were engaged and eliminated. The Red Wasps had finally left the tunnels, and the moment they did, United States satellite systems and the MQ-4C Triton surveillance drones that had been flying continuous orbits from the UAE tracked their launch points in real time, producing the targeting coordinates that the pre-positioned KC-135 refueling aircraft were already in position to support. Before the smoke of the Iranian attack had cleared, American strikes were already hitting the facilities from which those weapons had emerged. The retaliatory strikes were not indiscriminate. They were directly linked to the facilities the IRGC had exposed during the attack itself. Every launch point that the IRGC's weapons had emerged from during the attack was a coordinate that the American targeting architecture had tracked in real time. The targeting approach reflects the broader intelligence-driven doctrine of "show me where you are, and I will destroy where you came from." Bandar Abbas, the primary base of IRGC naval forces, was struck. Keshm Island's port and IRGC naval facilities were targeted. The Bahman port complex was hit. Missile and drone launch positions in Sirik and Bandar Khamir were destroyed. An IRGC naval police checkpoint in Minab was struck. The intelligence picture that months of satellite imagery analysis, signals collection, human intelligence development, and persistent overhead surveillance had been unable to fully establish, because the facilities were underground and sealed, was delivered voluntarily and completely by the IRGC's own decision to activate those facilities for a strike that the Aegis systems absorbed without damage. The IRGC had spent decades carefully concealing these missile cities from American intelligence collection. In one night's operation, it revealed the location, the access point configuration, and the weapon systems inventory of facilities that had been successfully hidden from the targeting database. The trap produced exactly the target list that the United States had spent years trying to build by other means, and the organization that walked into it did so believing it was executing the decisive military blow that would demonstrate the irrelevance of American naval power in the Strait and force Washington to negotiate on the IRGC's terms. Now let us talk about what the IRGC's propaganda response to May 7th reveals about the state of the organization's institutional psychology. Because the gap between what the IRGC's own doctrine produced that night and what the IRGC told its population it had produced is the most psychologically revealing aspect of the entire engagement. Iranian state media broadcast a very different account of May 7th than the operational record produces. Official statements from the Iranian military claimed that at least 3 American warships had been hit and had fled the strait. State television ran celebratory coverage with graphics depicting Iranian missiles striking American naval vessels. Crowds gathered in Iran's Revolution Square, genuinely believing, on the basis of their government's reporting, that Iran had struck a historic blow against American naval power, the kind of blow that the IRGC's leadership narrative had been promising its population was possible for 47 years of institutional history. None of the IRGC's claims were corroborated by any independent evidence. There are no photographs of damaged American warships, no signals intercepts indicating distress calls from vessels taking on water, no satellite imagery showing American destroyers with visible damage, no Allied or neutral maritime authority reporting disabled American naval vessels in the strait or its approaches. United States Central Command explicitly denied the claims, and the 3 destroyers were subsequently accounted for without visible damage. The propaganda machine had told a story that the observable world did not confirm, and that gap between the victory the IRGC declared and the defeat the operational record documented is the most consequential, long-term strategic consequence of May 7th for the Islamic Republic's internal legitimacy. Propaganda is not merely a communications tool for authoritarian governments. It is a mechanism of internal legitimacy that the regime's entire governing claim depends upon. When a regime tells its population that it has won a battle, and the population has no independent means of verifying the claim, the narrative holds as long as the information environment remains sealed. But the gap between the official story and the observable reality has a tendency to widen over time, in ways that even the most comprehensive information control cannot fully prevent. Satellite imagery circulates through diaspora networks. Relatives of port workers in Bandar Abbas see the damage to infrastructure that state media says was not damaged. The economic consequences of the continued blockade make themselves felt in food prices and fuel availability, regardless of what the television says. And the image of President Pezeshkian meeting with what Iranian social media described as a cardboard cutout of Supreme Leader Khamenei, images that generated serious public debate about the actual state of Iranian leadership rather than being immediately dismissed as foreign disinformation, is the symptom of a population whose trust in its government's information management is at its most fragile point in the conflict's history. The IRGC's propaganda machine painted itself into a corner on May 7th that it has not been able to escape in the 10 days since the engagement. Having declared victory in a battle it lost comprehensively, it now faces the ongoing task of explaining why the blockade continues, why oil revenues remain at zero, why the storage tanks at Karg Island are so full that loading operations have halted and a 71-kilometre oil slick is spreading in the adjacent waters, why port infrastructure in Bandar Abbas is damaged again, and why the strategic situation is not improving on any of the dimensions that the claimed victory on May 7th was supposed to have changed. The propaganda victory and the operational defeat are irreconcilable, and the gap between them is growing wider with every day the blockade continues and every barrel of oil that cannot be exported. Now let us connect May 7th directly to what is happening today on May 18th, 2026, because everything that has occurred since that night is the consequence of what that night revealed and what it destroyed. The IRGC's sea denial doctrine was the ideological and practical core of its claim to be a credible military force against a technologically superior adversary. The specific argument was that the Strait of Hormuz's confined geography, combined with a swarm doctrine's ability to saturate any single defensive system through simultaneous multi-domain pressure, gave the IRGC an asymmetric advantage that negated American naval technological superiority in the 21 nautical mile choke point. This argument was the strategic foundation of everything the IRGC told the Iranian government, the Iranian population, and its proxy networks about why resistance to American pressure was viable and why the costs of that resistance were worth bearing. On the night of May 7th, 3 Aegis-equipped destroyers demonstrated conclusively that the argument was wrong. The specific threat model the IRGC built its swarm doctrine around, multi-axis, multi-domain saturation attacks in confined littoral waters, is precisely the threat model that the Aegis combat system was designed to defeat. The system was built with the IRGC's specific operational doctrine as one of the primary design requirements. The IRGC's attack on May 7th was not a surprise to the Aegis system. It was the scenario the system was built to process, and it processed it completely, with no American casualties and no American ship damage, while simultaneously exposing the underground facilities whose targeting data the United States had been trying to build for decades. The doctrine failed. The facilities were exposed and struck. The propaganda victory claimed in the failure's wake is increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of observable economic and operational reality. And the organization that failed so completely on May 7th has now, on May 17th, struck a nuclear power plant during a ceasefire. That escalation is not the behavior of an organization that believes it won on May 7th. It is the behavior of an organization that knows it lost and is trying to find a leverage instrument that its failed conventional doctrine cannot produce. The nuclear power plant strike at Barakah on May 17th is the direct descendant of May 7th's failure. When the sea denial doctrine fails, when the missile cities have been exposed and struck, when the IRGC's ships are at the bottom of the Persian Gulf, when the fast attack boat presence in the strait has declined from 40 boats per transit to 2 or 3, when the underground missile cities have been eliminated and 90% of the defense industrial base has been destroyed, the organization that built its institutional identity around its military capacity has only one remaining card above the conventional military threshold: the threat to targets that the international community has specifically and legally prohibited from attack. Nuclear power plants. Civilian infrastructure whose damage could produce consequences that extend beyond the geography of the conflict producing the attack. That is the Baraka strike. That is what May 7th's comprehensive failure of the IRGC's sea denial doctrine has produced 10 days later. An organization that has exhausted its conventional military options is reaching for the unconventional escalatory threat as the only remaining instrument available. And the American military's response: F-16 CJ Wild Weasels surging to continuous combat air patrols over the strait, F-35s maintaining the overhead coverage that eliminated the gap through which the Baraka drone reached the nuclear plant's perimeter, the Energy Secretary publicly stating that the military method will be employed in the coming days, the New York Times reporting that operations could start as soon as this week, is the answer to that escalatory reach that every military indicator in the theatre is positioned to deliver. Now let us get into the economic dimension of the trap that May 7th completed. Because the military engagement was only one layer of the pressure that the night of May 7th was designed to apply, and the economic layer has been operating continuously since the engagement produced the targeting list that destroyed Iran's coastal military infrastructure. Iran produces between 2 and 3.5 million barrels of oil per day, depending on field maintenance cycles and production management decisions. Nearly all of that output needs to move through maritime export terminals, concentrated on and near the Persian Gulf coast, where the blockade's enforcement architecture is positioned. When exports are blocked, the oil does not stop being produced. It keeps being extracted from the fields at the production rates that reservoir management requires, and it has nowhere to go. Iran's total oil storage capacity is estimated at somewhere between 40 and 90 million barrels, depending on which facilities are being counted and what their current operational status is. Under the full production scenario, with the current near-complete export blockade in effect, that storage capacity fills within weeks. When it fills, Iranian energy planners face a choice with no good options. Cut production and accept the direct revenue losses running to hundreds of millions of dollars per day, while simultaneously risking the reservoir damage that rapid production curtailment can produce in certain geological formations, or continue producing and risk the physical damage to pipeline and storage infrastructure that results when pressure builds in systems designed to maintain continuous crude oil flow. Heavy crude oil, which constitutes a significant portion of Iranian output, is particularly unforgiving when flow slows or stops. The waxes and asphaltenes present in heavy crude begin to separate and adhere to pipeline walls as temperature and flow rate decrease, causing blockages that reduce throughput efficiency and in severe cases produce damage that requires costly and time-consuming remediation to repair. The satellite imagery showing no tanker activity at Karg Island's loading terminals in multiple consecutive observation windows, combined with the 71-kilometre oil slick spreading in the adjacent waters, is the visual evidence of the storage crisis that the May 7th engagement's confirmation of the blockade's effectiveness has been producing for weeks. And the $500 million daily revenue loss that the blockade is inflicting is the economic arithmetic of what happens when a country whose government revenue is 70% oil export dependent cannot export oil. China's and Russia's positions in this conflict deserve the analytical precision that the strategic framing of great power solidarity with Iran does not provide. China is the largest buyer of Iranian crude oil. It has rhetorically condemned American military actions in the Strait. It has not deployed naval assets to support Iran. It has not threatened consequences for American strikes on Iranian military infrastructure. And it has not offered anything resembling a concrete security commitment to Iran's territorial integrity or its continued oil export capacity. China's relationship with Iran is transactional at its foundation. China purchases Iranian crude at a significant discount to Brent pricing because Iranian crude is sanctioned and therefore available to buyers willing to absorb the secondary sanctions risk at a price that reflects that risk. That transactional relationship does not extend to risking Chinese naval vessels or Chinese personnel in a confrontation with the most capable navy on earth over oil that China can source from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Brazil, and increasingly from the United States at competitive prices, under the 600,000 barrel per day American crude commitment that Xi Jinping made at the Beijing summit last week. She told Trump she would not supply military equipment to Iran. She co-signed the American red lines on Iranian nuclear weapons and Hormuz reopening. She said, "If I could be of any help whatsoever, I would like to help." That is not the posture of a Chinese government that intends to absorb the strategic and economic costs of defending Iran's position against a force it has concluded is winning. Russia's position is rhetorically sharper, but practically even more revealing. Moscow condemned American actions in terms designed for domestic Russian consumption and for the performance of anti-American solidarity that its alliance relationships require. But Moscow has also been the primary financial beneficiary of the Hormuz closure that its rhetoric opposes. When Iranian oil exports are blocked and global oil prices exceed $100 per barrel, every barrel of Russian crude that reaches a buyer is sold at a price elevated by the supply disruption that the blockade has created. Every tanker that turns back from Hormuz is a barrel that buyers source from alternative suppliers, including Russia. Moscow is not going to take actions that end a situation that is generating it hundreds of millions of dollars per day in elevated oil export revenues. The vetoes at the UN Security Council will be used. Beyond the vetoes, Iran is operationally alone. Here is the complete, honest assessment of where this conflict stands on May 18, 2026, with the May 7th Traps legacy fully incorporated into the current operational picture. The IRGC's sea denial doctrine failed comprehensively on May 7th against exactly the defensive system it was built to defeat. The missile cities, whose exposure it had spent decades preventing, were exposed in a single night by the IRGC's own decision to activate them. The underground facilities were struck. The propaganda victory, declared in the failure's wake, is collapsing under the weight of observable economic and military reality. The organization that failed has responded by striking a nuclear power plant during a ceasefire, which is the operational expression of an institution that has reached the end of its conventional military options and is reaching for the unconventional escalatory threat as the last remaining instrument. The Energy Secretary said the military method will be employed in the coming days if there is no path to a diplomatic settlement. The New York Times said operations could start as soon as this week. Delta Force operators have been in the Middle East since March, waiting for the Isfahan authorization. The F-16CJ Wild Weasels are surging their sorties. The RC-135 rivet joints are building the targeting picture at 40,000 feet. The E-2D Advanced Hawkeyes are tracking 2,000 simultaneous targets at ranges exceeding 300 nautical miles. The GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators are restocked. Operation Sledgehammer is named. Israel is on its highest military alert, and Iran struck a nuclear power plant during a ceasefire the day before today. The strait at its narrowest point is 54 kilometers wide. That number has become the defining geographic fact of this conflict, a corridor that looks manageable on a map, but that is, in practice, controlled by whoever has the most capable ships, the most effective air defense, the most comprehensive intelligence picture, and the most patient willingness to wait for an adversary to open its tunnel doors and reveal exactly what it has been hiding. On the night of May 7th, none of those advantages belonged to Tehran. On May 18th, 2026, 10 days after May 7th and 1 day after the Barakah nuclear plant strike, none of those advantages have returned to Tehran. The trap produced the target list. The target list produced the strikes. The strikes produced the propaganda failure. The propaganda failure produced the institutional desperation. The institutional desperation produced the Baraka strike. And the Baraka strike has produced the next phase of the operational timeline that the wild weasels, surging their sorties this morning, are already beginning to execute.